So someone was asking me for some insight into my reading habits, what reading does for me, and that kind of thing, and how it's been a part of my life. And I'd be off to bed after this. Anyway, how reading has been a part of my life and all of that. And I started to do just one video about the topic and realized very quickly that just within that there was so much stuff that I could talk about. And so I might talk about a lot of, you know, life experiences with reading a lot more and that kind of thing. And it's great because I've done a lot of commentary on specific books. I've talked about the craft of writing through the years and that sort of thing. But I've never talked about the craft of reading and my love of reading. And it's so interesting because, I grew up in an extremely, I grew up in an extremely literate household, so much so that one time when we moved, the movers told my parents that they had worked out that we had 5,000 pounds of books. And, I'm sure you can tell, that should come as no surprise, given that I probably have, about 2,000 to 2,500 pounds worth of books myself at this point. Um, Books are the ultimate decoration in my mind, because, for any room, it just feels so much better to be surrounded by books. And it's so funny, but like, these two shelves you see behind me, these are mostly books I've already read. Uh, but I have more shelves over here and that kind of thing. I should go through and show off a lot more of my collection. But to talk about the craft of reading, I grew up in a very, like I said, a very literate household, and was always just a voracious reader. And here's the thing, we've seen this resurgence in physical media in the era of streaming, which is so interesting to me. People will pay good money to get a vinyl copy of or even a CD or a cassette tape copy of an album that they could have heard, essentially for free, with the exception of a streaming, Spotify or Apple Music membership fee or something like that. They will, um, they will pay more money to have that physical copy because they've realized that there is something important in the ownership of it, and there's something important in the ritual of sitting down and, devoting their time to actually appreciate it and that sort of thing. And books are I think, the ultimate example of that. And, or the ultimate example of that ritual of fully devoting yourself to something. You know, I will put on a movie to watch while I'm playing video games, that kind of thing. That's the level of, and to be fair, I personally have always been at that level. I grew up while watching movies and playing computer games at the same time and everything. I think a lot of us did. But reading is this deeply insular thing. And there is something uniquely captivating about sitting down, uniquely wonderful about sitting down with a great book and devoting yourself and devoting your attention to it. I saw the author, Jonathan Lethem, speak at a speaking engagement that he did in Boston while I was in college, and he he did. I think this was on the. I want to say this was either on the book tour for Motherless Brooklyn or Fortress of Solitude. I can't remember which one, but I asked him a question. I don't remember the exact question that I asked him, but I remember that he told me that. I remember him telling me that one of the great things about literature was, or about the written word, was that everyone in this room, he said, could read the same book and have their own unique experience in their imagination. And that's such a profoundly true thing. And I think that is why books more than anything lend themselves to, we love to talk about what it all meant. When we see a movie we like or show we like, we love to dig into what it all meant and everything. And I think books lend themselves to the deepest possible version of that. One, because of the commitment of time, but some of the best friendships I've had in my life have been with people who we were book buddies. We would pick a book and read it together and talk about it in extraordinary detail and everything. And that's just one of the most wonderful things that there is. And that's why, followers to my channel will know I have a series called Book Talk with Jordan and Stefan that I have not done in a long time, because just coordinating our schedules and everything gets difficult, gets aggravating and stuff like that, but are complicated. But Stefan's a great example of that, and a great example of the kind of dialogue that I love to have around books and stuff like that. And so I could go, and this is why I thought I ought to do multiple videos talking about my experiences as a reader, above and beyond just my experiences as a writer. But there's so much to it. One of the most fascinating, the person asking the question wanted to know, like, what it does for me, what the experience does for me and how it impacts my life. And I'll tell you, this is one thing. I mean, the experience of reading, even the same book changes every time you read it. And the experience of reading is different with every book that you read. But one of the more recent phenomenons I've discovered, we are all right now, we're all, I think, in the world that was predicted by William Gibson, where there is so much, he predicted a world where there would be so much digital information being transmitted in the air that it was actually making people physically sick. I think that we're in a world where there is so much psychological, or there's so much information, literal information, being transmitted on social media and tablets and the internet and everything, that it's making us psychologically sick. In fact, if you go look up a while back, I did a commentary on his book, Idoru, read the book Idoru, which was written in 1996, and it is chilling how much of our current society he predicted in that book. And then you're talking about a man who, is the inventor of the cyberpunk genre and saw the potential for the internet back when it was just this nerdy, egg-headed thing and that sort of thing. So he saw very accurately predicted a lot of the trends of the modern information age in his writing. But anyway, as I bring it up, as we are so inundated with screens, I have come to appreciate the ritual of reading even more, because it is so easy to get hooked on that low protein dopamine rush that we all get from our screens and being on our screens 24 hours a day, to the point where I have to, I feel the urge to check Facebook when I'm sitting at a traffic light for too long and that kind of thing. And not doing anything just feels maddening. We are really and truly sickly addicted to these screens, sadly. And there's good things about that. I can be a bitter old shut-in and still sit inside and communicate with the world and all of that. But with after experiencing the ubiquity of screens, I cannot tell you how much I relish the experience of the book, because the book fully departs you from the world, and it fully departs you into a world of the mind, and it has this wonderful effect of defragmenting the mind and re-engaging the mind, taking the mind from being a passive participant to being an active participant. And it's so interesting because that active facet that reading brings about, that active participation from the mind, is so great because it's so great because somehow that active participation is more relaxing than the passive participation. That's what's so weird. Like, I love, if I'm going to see a movie, the best way to do that is to go see it in the theater, and there's hardly ever anything good in the theaters anymore anyway. But I love to see a movie in the theater and experience the huge screen and the sound and all of that. But even that, I don't feel truly relaxed. Watching a movie is still a very active experience for me. Reading is not. And I mean, I'm sorry, I feel active, and my mind still feels on edge. It still feels like I'm doing something active, and yet my mind is passively consuming what I'm seeing. Yet when I'm reading and my mind is actively consuming what I'm seeing, I find that more relaxing. It's a very odd, very strange thing. Probably because on some primal level, watching a movie, especially at like the level of the Cineplex and everything, where it's huge, everything is huge, probably still engages a little bit of like the primitive survival instinct. Like there's so much sensory input, you stay a little bit on edge. But I'm just like that, and so what's interesting is I will find myself, if I want to read, I have to set aside time to read. I can't really do anything else while I'm reading. Sometimes I will put on background music when I read, and I'll tell you one of the best things. As much as I rail against the Catholic Church so much, I'm an Episcopalian if you're just joining us. As much as I rail about the Catholic Church, Catholic lo-fi, we all know about lo-fi beats and the popularity of things like lo-fi and vaporwave and stuff like that. Catholic lo-fi is this wonderful genre for reading, where you have like Gregorian monks that have been synced up to a very chill, slow beat, background beat and everything, and the sound of rain on top of it, all of that. And everything, when I'm reading, everything around me kind of becomes a facet of the ritual. And above and beyond what I'm reading, the ritual is so crucial. I like to, right now, the ritual is too cold for me to sit out on my back porch right now, back patio, or balcony. But one thing I really like about this place, my last place, I was down on the ground, and so I had a great back porch that I could sit on, but I would get eaten up with fleas and mosquitoes and everything else. This I'm up off the ground, so I have this great balcony that looks out on all of these trees, and the most wonderful thing in the world, the thing I cherish more than the time of day I cherish more than anything else, is nighttime, sitting out on the back porch reading when there is a thunderstorm coming through that's just gently rocking the trees back and forth, and there's rain. This is, the most the all human experiences pale in comparison to that. The only thing better could be reading in bed with the storm happening and everything. And so that's the wonderful effect of reading. And like I said, now in the world of screens, we feel it more than ever. But I've always been like that. The ritual of reading has always been important to me for shutting out the world. For example, when I was younger, I've talked about how the first school I ever went to was basically a hippie commune. But after that, after second grade, I started going to a normal public school. And that school, I remember when I started there, the cafeteria was horrible because it was just this huge explosion of sensory input. As soon as I walked in, all these kids screaming and making all kinds of noise and hollering and everything, and then the just grotesque smells emanating from the cafeteria food and all that crap, and just all of the stuff. It was just this awful time. And so I would take a book with me to sit and read to shut all of that stuff out, and it was so helpful. And I remember there was this one kid who used to tease me, used to give me shit for reading books at lunch. And I remember we were lining up to leave the lunchroom one day, and there were some other kids sitting nearby that were themselves reading books, and he said, "You see what you've done?" And so that uh, but that's always been important to me, the full disconnect from reality. And we're talking about the effect of reading books and why I love reading so much. But that's just the immediate thing, to say nothing of fully stepping into, yeah, fully passing through the wardrobe into Narnia, fully stepping into the realms of imagination. And it's so interesting. There's so many things about reading a story. One of the great things, I'm at the age where, so many of most of your favorite things in life are established when you're very young. And I'm fortunate that are relatively young. They're usually established in about the first 20 years of your life. And I'm so fortunate to be discovering with books. I feel like books are one of the few things, because there's an agelessness to it, to the art of reading. It's not like, it's kind of like, if you hear punk rock for the first time when you're 13 years old and you're full of energy, you're going to have a very different reaction to it from, if you hear punk rock for the first time when you're like 65 or 70. You experience things differently based on the energy and the tonality of it, a lot of different influences. Books are not like that. Books are an experience that is a fundamentally ageless experience. And so I can be uh, I can be at the age I am now and still discovering my favorite things. For example, I recently really fell in love with Kazuo Ishiguro. A friend of mine recommended this one. No, not it's not a friend of mine. A friend of mine had read it or had seen the movie, but one of my YouTube viewers recommended "Never Let Me Go" by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is a dystopian novel about organ harvesting. And really, it was not. It was this very beautiful, melancholic story about organ harvesting, and it's a fascinating read, made into a movie starring Carey Mulligan and Andrew Garfield and Keira Knightley. I remembered three people's names, and you have no idea how much of an accomplishment that was at my age. But anyway, made into a really good movie that was actually like very, very carefully accurate to the book, commendably so. But anyway, I really enjoyed this book, and it left me with such a haunting feeling because Kazuo Ishiguro. This book is told from the point of view of the some of these people, or one in particular, but these people who have been raised from birth to be these have their organs harvested. And it was such a fascinating read. And it's like, in American fiction, we normally think of like we normally would assume, and that if that's the narrator, then the narrator's gonna escape and break free and go off and live their best life, and screw the people that want to harvest my organs, and that kind of thing. But that's not the perspective he takes. He takes a very different perspective. And he's fascinated. Kazuo Ishiguro is fascinated by the servant class, the people, the servants. His most famous novel is Remains of the Day, which I haven't read. I've seen the movie of it starring Anthony Hopkins, and that deals with the life story of this butler, this very this very withdrawn and formal, the kind of stiff, formal butler, the kind of person that you normally think of as being in the background, but we follow his story. And it's such a fascinating perspective to take. And I just fell in love with it. And I read this book, Clara and the Sun, and oh my God, um, this became like my one of my new favorite books ever. I read this earlier this year, and I just cannot tell you how much I fell in love with this book. And it is the most incredible thing that books, more than anything else, have this transformative power, and it's a transformative power that never dies. One of the great one of the best lines I remember, if you've seen the movie, most people from my generation have seen Neverending Story, and probably also Neverending Story 2, the movies. Read the books, read the book. Obviously the book is better, but anyway, by Michael End. It's a fantastic book. Uh, but I think it's by Michael End. I hope I said that right. Anyway, I believe it is. But anyway, but in the second movie, there's a great line I love when he goes in the bookstore, and the guy won't let him borrow the Neverending Story book again. Won't let him read it, and uh, he says you have to understand, books change every time you read them, and that is so true. When if you go like, pick one of my favorite movies, Blue Velvet. Blue Velvet is going to be the same movie every single time I see it. I can change as a person and come back to it, but it's always going to be the same movie. A novel, on the other hand, is going to be different every time I read it. I love to say, I'll tell people that one of my all-time favorite novels is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. I read that in like eighth grade, and it stayed with me that long. But at some point, I need to go back and read it again as an adult, and that kind of thing, and experience it from a whole new angle. This book, Clara and the Sun, like I said, like I can't. If you're hearing this and looking, if you're hearing this video and looking for a book to read, go read Clara and the Sun. It will. Oh my God! It's just Kazuo Ishiguro did not start out as a science fiction writer, and even his science fiction does not really feel like science fiction. But this is a story about it's a story about a humanoid robot, a cyborg, an android rather, a very humanoid android that is hired to be is hired to be the companion for this sickly girl in this, again, dystopian future. And it's so beautiful. Like, there is such a long history of trying to, there's such a long history of stories about, going all the way back to Isaac Asimov, and even before that, of stories about robots that become more human. Seem, their inability to understand human beings ends up making them more human in the long run than the human beings around them. This is the most perfect iteration of that idea I've ever heard. It is so beautiful, and it's amazing to be reading this story, to be practically in tears reading this story about a robot, and about this thing that has ends up having a greater depth of humanity than anyone in the story, anyone else in the story. It's just, I don't want to ruin anything, but it's so amazing. And I'll tell you something else about uh, writing, or about reading books that's so great, is you can cast it however you want. You can make the characters, you can have the characters be played by famous actors if you want, or you can make their faces up from scratch, or you can cast your friends and family and people in your life as these characters. And I just kind of naturally will start experiencing sometimes, like when I read Never Let Me Go, I knew Carey Mulligan played the main character in the movie, so that kind of was my automatic mental image there. But like for Clara, for the main character in Clara and the Sun, I cast a teenage girl that I know. It's a teenage girl age character, but that I happen to know in that role and that kind of thing. It's like, because you will find like your people in your life and that sort of thing that fit with the fit that character and stuff like that. And so I cast someone that I know, and it just draws you into it so much more. And there's something so wonderful about that, and so utterly captivating about that. And so anyway, that's there's Player Piano, another great Kurt Vonnegut novel. And there's Snuff by Chuck Palahniuk, which I don't recommend you read on an empty stomach. I mean, on a full stomach, sorry. Empty stomach probably be fine, just some dry heaving. Anyway, that kind of thing, there's so much. And I'll go back, I'm sure in 10 years, I'll reread Clara and the Sun, and Clara will be someone else at that point, and because I'll have a different experience that I need to get out of that that character and that kind of thing. And that's what I love about that's what's so wonderful about reading. You can read the same book over and over again, and you get something new, a new depth out of it every time, and that's why people, I've read Atlas Shrugged 3 or 4 times at this point, and I'll probably read it again to get ready for once that new mini series comes out. I'll read it again to get ready for that. And people are like, how can you read this massive book? this copy I've got's 1,070 pages. How can you read this 1,000 page book? It's like, how can you not? The length of a book, if it's a good book, or I should say a book I like. I know a lot of people bristle at Atlas Shrugged, but if it's a book I like, the page count means nothing. Right now, I'm reading Runaway Horses by Yukio Mishima, and it's funny. I'm almost halfway through the book. It's a fairly hefty volume, but it's just so compulsively readable. And what's interesting to me, the interesting thing to me about reading is the effect of the details. It's interesting. This is an interesting idea where, I love the writing of Paul Auster, for example. Paul Auster is amazing. If you've never read the New York trilogy, read the New York trilogy. See if I've got it readily on hand here. I can show it to you. Yeah, the New York trilogy, which is City of Glass, The Locked Room, and Ghosts, which I think it's pretty much only available as this single volume now. But the New York trilogy is incredible. And the friend who turned me on to him said he's like the American Haruki Murakami, and I was like, sold. I think there's Paul Auster tends to crank the existential dread up to 11, but other than that, it's a fairly... Side note. I just got done this year I read this book, Song for the Unraveling of the World by Brian Evenson. You want to talk about something that's nothing like anything else you've read. I can't recommend it enough. Anyway, I love Paul Auster, but he wrote this one book that I thought was absolutely horrible called 1, 2, 3, 4. And it's just a literary exercise in telling this one guy's life story 4 different ways. And that was especially aggravating because it gets into like the 60s and the summer of love and all that. And I'm sorry, it's one of those, there's so many great artists and writers and musicians, everything from the 60s, but I'm sorry that I'm done with the era. I want to move forward. I know that there's a ton of baby boomers that are, looking back on the most important time of their lives at this point and everything, but I'm done with it, man. It's just boring. Let's look at what's going on now and what's happening in the future and stuff like that. But anyway, I read 1, 2, 3, 4, and I didn't like it as a book, but what I really appreciated about it was the way that these four different concepts, he takes one defining life-changing event in this main character's life and branches off in four different possible directions from where it could have gone. Uh, and if he just focused on one of them, it would have been an interesting enough book. But anyway, the point being, the book itself was not interesting, but I loved the way that these four different narratives kept giving me different perspectives on the minutia and the details of this fictional person's life, which is really, obviously that level of detail and everything is something you look for in reading. And so I started really feeling, it did give me the feeling like I was able to explore the story in a little bit more of a three-dimensional context and everything, kind of the same thing that you get out of House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski, which is an amazing book and arguably one of the best books ever written. And there's a reason that nobody ever talks about any of his other books, because all of his other books are so horribly, insufferably bad that it beggars belief. Like, it's totally beyond comprehension how bad every single one of his other books are. But House of Leaves, which, well, I could have sworn I had that around here somewhere immediately on hand. But anyway, I need my regular dose of existential dread, so I can just open to any page of House of Leaves and read about Johnny Truant like rectally masturbating while deciphering cryptographic information from the Navidson record and all of that. But anyway, the point being, what the hell was my point? Oh my God. Oh yeah, anyway, the point being that exploratory aspect of it, of getting lost in the details, is so fascinating. I'll tell you something. I heard the Bishop Robert Barron, who's a major media personality, he said something interesting about the Bible. He said the Bible is not one book, it's a library. And you have to read it. You have to know when you're in the history section, when you're in the poetry section, when you're in the fantasy section, and that kind of thing. And I thought that's a really interesting and insightful way to interpret the Bible. But I started looking at books in general like that, like that I'm when I'm in a book, when I'm reading a book, I'm not just following the linear narrative. I'm also exploring. I'm not just following a linear description of events, even if the story itself is linear. What I'm experiencing is a series of a series of kind of poetic fixations on one thing after another, and those descriptions kind of those descriptions have the effect of forming a larger image, a larger narrative image, but we stop and focus on each one of these poetic moments within a narrative, and it creates a larger whole. And again, that's one of those things that nothing is really like that. No other entertainment medium is really like that. Like a great writer for the kind of what I'm talking about here is Yukio Mishima, where, this is Yukio Mishima. This is Confessions of a Mask, which is his first novel. It was the one that launched him to, just overnight literary superstardom in Japan. And it's a semi-autobiographical novel about growing up gay during World War II era Japan. And it's a fascinating thing. But you think about, okay, what story is telling? That's the premise. Listen just briefly to how it begins. For many years, I claimed I could remember things seen at the time of my own birth. Whenever I said so, the grown-ups would laugh at first, but then, wondering if they were not being tricked, they would look distastefully at the pallid face of that unchildlike child. Sometimes I happened to say so in the presence of callers who were not close friends of the family. Then my grandmother, fearing I would be taken for an idiot, would interrupt in a sharp voice and tell me to go somewhere else and play. While they were still smiling from their laughter, the grown-ups would usually set about trying to confute me with some sort of scientific explanation. Trying to devise explanations that a child's mind could grasp, they would always start babbling with no little dramatic zeal, saying that a baby's eyes are not open yet at birth, or that even if his eyes are completely open, a newborn baby could not possibly see things clearly enough to remember them. So we are now, what's interesting, so these recollections that he's having, all of these are being pieced together in such a way as to kind of give form to a void, a very confusing void, because he's describing eventually coming to the understanding that he's gay in at a time and a place where he doesn't really even have a concept of what that is. It's not like, it's not like now where it's very, we're very open about, oh, you like men, you're gay, that kind of thing. He's trying to come to a grasp of this, having what this is, having no frame of reference at all to understand what he's feeling and why he feels differently about things from others, sexually about things from other people. And so he's starting in these very vague conceptual terms to kind of start to formulate in your mind the way he had to formulate in his mind this very abstract thing that remained abstract for a much longer period of time than it would have been for most people. And, or I'm sorry, that it would have been for most people nowadays, where we know we have a very quick frame of reference for what it means to be gay and that sort of thing. And he writes beautifully about the psychology of that. And that's one of the things I've always loved about Mishima. And you can tell, like, right here, I've got a huge, collection of Mishima books, and my local, or the Barnes and Noble in Buckhead in Atlanta. I was there the other day, and they have all the rest of the books in the Sea of Fertility series, which is Mishima's magnum opus. And I'm reading Runaway Horses is the second one. The first one in that series, Spring Snow, is my favorite Mishima book. But anyway, you see how he takes these moments of descriptive poetry and starts building them one on top of the other. And that's such a unique concept. That concept is very unique to literature, and something that we really only experience in the context of literature. Like I said, everything else is provided. The entirety of it is provided for us. Literature is the only thing where we're painting. Music is close. In that it also engages the mind in a similar way. But literature is really the only thing that fully engages the creativity of the mind of the reader as we're reading. And so it is a wholly unique experience. And like I said, in my mind, one of the great experiences of life is reading, and it's the craft of reading. And it's kind of like, why do I write? Because I can think of no greater mode of contribution to the human race. And it's just it's put it this way, it's the only experience that is always everything I need it to be, if that makes sense. Even reading a bad book is still the experience of reading. I tried recently. I tried reading The Regulators by Stephen King, and thought it just ended up thinking it was completely ridiculous, hacked together stuff. And a lot of people don't think that's one of his better books. I'm not a huge Stephen King fan in general. He's done a lot of stuff I've liked, but I've come to realize that I actually like a lot of my introduction to him was very much through the movies that that were made, and so it's kind of like, of course, The Shining is incredible. Stanley Kubrick directing, Jack Nicholson, and that kind of thing. But anyway, currently reading Bag of Bones as well, reading Bag of Bones by Stephen King, and I'm moderately enjoying it. It's not great. It's not his worst. It's not terrible. It's readable, but it's still very he's very much a kind of, as much as I was saying I love detail, he's still very much a diarrhea of the keyboard kind of writer. I mean, he can just he gets off on little side tangents that don't really add to the narrative. That's unique to him. But anyway, the point being, even then, even as I read something like that I'm not a tremendous fan of, and I'm not putting him down altogether, it's just very middle of the road for me. Very middle of the road experience, not like not transcendental like Clara and the Sun and that sort of thing. And it's just decent. But anyway, even within that, I can still get lost in the stacking upon details. There's a moment I just read in Bag of Bones. It's about a widower who's having writer's block because his wife died. I've come to realize that writers who are out of ideas are a very common recurring trope in Stephen King. But anyway, it's a writer who's dealing with the death of his wife, and at one point there's a point where stops and talks about, he's going through her room in their vacation cabin where she kept all of her knitting supplies and everything, and just going into that moment of talking about the knitting supplies it gives you a greater reality of knitting needles and yarn than you would have if you were actually surrounded by those things, because you're not just getting the experience of those things, you're seeing them through the perspective of a greater depth of meaning. It's kind of like if you were to walk into a room and see knitting needles, sewing needles, and spindles of yarn sitting there, all you would think is sewing needles and spindles of yarn. But we're endowing them with this deeper meaning, this deeper resonance, and that little thing becomes fascinating even there. And that wonderful experience is true even of a book that I'm only mid-level enjoying, that kind of thing. And yes, some books are so bad I have to stop reading. I got within about 250 pages of finishing the regulars. I keep wanting to say the refrigerators, of finishing the regulators, and it was just so, I just couldn't do it. Some books do grind to a halt for me. Some books are just like that. Some books, one of the great pleasures, one of the most unexpected pleasures, is reading a book and hating it, and then something happens and you absolutely love it. Like one of the great examples of that, when I was in college, I was taking it upon myself. I was studying music, but I was taking it upon myself to read like many of the great classics that I'd always wanted to read. So like I read The Castle by Franz Kafka and loved it. I read The Glass Bead Game by Hermann Hesse and loved it. And so many things like that. One of the books I read was Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs, and I hated it because it felt like the literary equivalent of a Jackson Pollock painting. It's just zany and bizarre, and I couldn't, it is incredibly difficult to follow. It makes a lot more sense if you hear it in an audiobook format, because then it's more conversational. You realize, like, is this guy telling you this story, it's supposed to sound like this, that kind of thing. And but what was interesting, I read it. Now, on top of that, even though I was studying jazz at the time, I was studying jazz in school, and for that reason, because I was so inundated with theory and compositional techniques and harmony and chordal harmony and stuff like that, I hated free jazz, and I couldn't stand the music of Ornette Coleman because I just could not appreciate free jazz because it flew against all of the very rigorous technical knowledge that I was getting at the time. And lo and behold, I got the rented the DVD, and this is again why physical media is so important. I rented the DVD of the film adaptation of Naked Lunch, which stars Peter Weller of RoboCop fame. And I watched the movie. It makes a little bit more sense as a movie, just because it kind of they took some liberties that kind of tie the narrative, this very free form narrative, together a lot better. Very train of thought kind of narrative. But anyway, I watched it, and then I watched the director commentary, which also featured commentary from Peter Weller. Peter Weller, not many people know this, is also a jazz trumpet player. And as I was watching the movie with the commentary, he made a great point. So Ornette Coleman, who I just mentioned, did the soundtrack, collaborated with Howard Shore to do the soundtrack for Naked Lunch, and that's my favorite, now my favorite Ornette Coleman soundtrack. Anyway, so Peter Weller was talking about this, and he said that, and he said this line that made everything make sense for me. He said, Ornette Coleman was the perfect person to do the soundtrack of Naked Lunch, because Naked Lunch is a free jazz novel. And he said that, and as soon as he said that, the writing of William S. Burroughs suddenly made sense, and the music of Ornette Coleman suddenly made sense. Everything fell into place for these two artists that were I just didn't think I had it in me to ever appreciate. And I hated that I couldn't appreciate these things, because, I was surrounded by people like, yeah, man, you gotta, you don't dig Burroughs, you don't dig Ornette Coleman. I mean, what's wrong with you, man? That kind of thing. I was surrounded by people like that. And then finally it made sense. Both of these things made sense. And I went back and read Naked Lunch, and I got it, and I was now reading it correctly. Now that I knew that what I was doing was reading was the literary equivalent of free jazz, now I was reading it correctly. I realized that I needed to read William S. Burroughs the way I would read like a Zippy the Pinhead comic or something like that. And so I went back and read Naked Lunch again, and I got it. And it worked for me. I finally figured out how to read Naked Lunch. And now it's, one of my favorite books. And so, and I love Ornette Coleman. Also to what I said about, I love the Naked Lunch soundtrack, but as I think of it, his collaboration album with Pat Metheny, Song X, is probably actually my favorite Ornette Coleman album. But anyway, so that gives you some idea about what reading means to me, and I'm going to go do some reading now before I put myself to bed and everything. So it was a great question. I'd like to talk about reading a lot more. I think that's like I said, I've talked about writing a lot. Reading is, of course, the other side of that, and probably the more important side of that. Like the young adult writer Avi once said that writers don't write writing, they write reading, and that's so true. A book there's going to be a lot more reading of a book done than there is writing of a book. The writing happens one time, or a series of times, and then it's over, and then the book in its final form is going to be read a lot more, or there's going to be a lot more time spent reading the book than there was writing it, most likely. So anyway, great topic, and great to talk about that rather than how the world is going to hell in a handcart. So peace.